I want to thank everybody for being here this morning, and if you're joining us on the live stream, you're welcome as well. You probably, when you left your home this morning, unless you got an advance copy of the pink sheet, probably didn't expect to see me up here this morning, and neither did I. Last Sunday, Todd called me about 9 o'clock. If I'd gone to bed earlier, he would have missed me. But he called me about 9 o'clock and said, "Can you put together something for us the 9 o'clock Sunday morning?" After hemming and hawing in a little trepidation and warning him about, be careful what you ask for, I said yes, so here I am. I think we'll be able to have plenty of time to get to our classes when we're done here this morning. And having said that, and now that my butterflies are flying in formation, let's get with it. In Hebrews 11, it's commonly called the roll call of faith, or the hall of faith. And it's because the people there are great examples of faith. The writer of the letter of Hebrews spends the first 31 verses talking about these people, their great faith, from post-Eden to the conquest. And then, as if running out of time or running out of space, he begins to just give names. And the idea is the names don't need any qualification. You know who they are and what they did. And then just as abruptly, he starts naming just deeds without names. And again, they're kind of synonymous with one another. When Todd called me this, I thought, who in Hebrews 11 could I talk about? Now, that wasn't the assignment. That was just where I naturally gravitated. And of course, one of the things that is consistent with the people in Hebrews 11 is their faith. They all faced crises at one time or another. And the hallmark of their faith was the consistency with which they faced it. I looked at some of those about whom much is written. Abraham and Sarah, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, David, Samuel. I couldn't do them any justice at all. And then, of course, there's some there that they don't have a whole lot written about them. Enoch only has 5 verses. There's not a lot of material there. Ultimately, I decided to go with the last phrase there, the deeds without a name. I want to look at the last phrase in verse 33. Stopped the mouths of lions. You know who we're going to talk about. I don't have to tell you. When you read that phrase, the name that immediately pops to your mind is Daniel, and his account is found in Daniel 6. And we'll spend some time there this morning. But before we do that, let's get a little background what's going on here. Let's go back to chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar has just conquered Jerusalem, and he's giving a big banquet for Belshazzar is the king of Babylon at this time. And he's giving a big banquet for his lords. And it is there that he sees literally the handwriting on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel upsarin. You've been weighed in God's balance. You've been found wanting. Now your kingdom is going to be taken away from you. That night, the Medes attack. Belshazzar is killed. And Darius the Mede is now king. There's some debate about who Darius is. Some scholars think, since they can't find anybody in the ancient Persian literature that matches his description, that he was a fiction. And therefore, Daniel is a fiction, and the account of Daniel is a fiction. I don't think so. And then there's some who say that Darius and Cyrus are the same guy, that Darius was his proper name and Cyrus was a name that he took when he ascended to the throne. That seems to be more reasonable to me. But it doesn't matter, because ultimately the Holy Spirit told the writer of Daniel to call him Darius, and that's all okay with me, unless you want to call him Darius. Anyway, Darius reorganizes his kingdom. He appoints Daniel and 3 other guys as presidents, the ESV calls it, over his kingdom. Other versions call them commissioners or governors or something like that. Daniel distinguishes himself before Darius, just as he had with Nebuchadnezzar before him, almost from the moment that he arrived in Babylon. And I think the reason he did that was he took to heart the admonition of Ecclesiastes 9:10, which says, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might." There was an elder at a church that we attended in Pasadena years ago, and he had a saying. He said, "I work for the Lord. The pay ain't much, but the retirement is out of this world." That was Daniel. He didn't work for the king of Persia. He worked for the Lord. Darius is so impressed with Daniel that he contemplates turning the administration of the entire kingdom over to him. The other two guys didn't like that at all. So they decide they've got to get rid of Daniel. They knew Daniel had an excellent character, and there was nothing they could bring against him with regard to how he behaved before the king. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't disrespectful. He wasn't disloyal. He wasn't an embezzler. He just wasn't corrupt. They couldn't find anything against him. But they knew Daniel. And they knew that if they were going to entrap him with anything, it was going to have to be with something with his relationship to God. So they devised a scheme and presented it to Darius. And beginning in verse 6, it says, O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom and the prefects and the satraps and the counselors and governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so it cannot be changed according to the laws and Medes of Persians, which cannot be revoked. You see what they did there? First of all, they lied. Not all the administrators of the kingdom had agreed to this. Certainly Daniel would not have agreed to a proposition that required you to worship a man. Secondly, they flattered him. This decree put Cyrus above their gods. Now, it's very doubtful that any of the ancient egomaniacal kings could have resisted something like that. And lastly, they applied a little soft pressure to him. It's just temporary. Just 30 days, then we'll go back to worshiping our gods. What harm can that bring? Darius fell for it. How did Daniel respond to this? What did he do? I think we get a better idea by looking at what he didn't do. First of all, he didn't try to get out of it. He didn't go to Darius and say, King, I'm not in on this. They didn't consult me about this. I don't agree with this. I know the law can't be changed, but you can pass an addendum that exempts me from this. He didn't do it. He didn't make a public scene and confront Darius when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, a.k.a. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were faced with having to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image. They did not. Nebuchadnezzar politely encouraged them to remember, you've got to bow down when the music plays, or you face the fiery furnace. They stood before Nebuchadnezzar and all the other officials there, and they said, we're not going to do it. And if we have to, God will protect us from the fiery furnace. And if he doesn't, it doesn't matter. We're not going to do it. He didn't have an open confrontation with Darius on this. He didn't hide. In fact, in verse 10 it says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and gave thanks before his God. He could have closed the windows. He could have prayed to himself. He could have done nothing for 30 days and let it pass and then pick up and resume worshiping God. But he didn't. And I think the key to his actions is the last phrase in verse 10 there. The ESV says, as he had done previously. New American Standard says, as he had been doing previously. But neither one of those really gives the impact of what is being said there. The New King James, I think, has it correct. It says, as was his custom since early days. Let's look at his early days. In chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar has conquered Jerusalem. He wants some of the captives sent to Babylon, serve at his palace. That's nothing unusual. To have captives in your palace serving you show dominion over their lands. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, and Daniel are among those chosen. Who were they? Verse 3 says they were of the royal family and nobility. Verse 4 says they were youths. Now, in biblical terms, you were considered a youth until you hit about 30 years old. That's when you were a man. Many people believe that's when Jesus began his ministry because he was about 30 years old. So they were under 30. But there's another word that's usually translated lad or boy, and that's for males who were under 20. So they were not boys and they weren't men, so they were between 20 and 30 years old. They were good looking, it says. They possessed wisdom and knowledge and understanding. They were the cream of the crop of Judean nobility. And now they're being taken into captivity. They were placed under the care of the chief eunuch, who saw a 3-year training program for them before they could be presented to the king. Some scholars believe that because they were put in charge of the chief eunuch, that they themselves had been made eunuchs. They were taught the language and the literature of the Chaldeans, and it doesn't specifically say so, but in a training program such as this, they would have also been instructed on culture and religion. They were provided food from the king's portions. The Babylonians changed their names. Their new names had some kind of connection with the Babylonian gods. And of course, this was to strip them of their Jewish identity and to make them Babylonians. And it's here that we see the first recorded demonstration of Daniel's faith. Here he is, a young man, exiled in a foreign land, taken away from everything that he had known, everything that was good to him, in a captivity in a foreign land. He could have felt pity for himself and said, God has abandoned me, I'm going to abandon God. But he didn't. Instead, Daniel resolved he would not eat the king's food or drink his wine. Now, why did he do that? A couple reasons, maybe. Maybe it was sacrifice to idols. No observant Jew would have eaten anything that had been sacrificed to an idol. It could have been that it was unclean based on the dietary restrictions of the law of Moses, pork, for example. Or it could have been prepared in a way that was in violation of the law of Moses. Daniel, along with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, work a deal with the chief eunuch. Let us eat just vegetables and drink water for 10 days. And let us see what it looks like after 10 days, and then we'll revisit this. After 10 days, they were in better shape than any of the other exiles. So from then on, they were vegetarians. They did not partake of the king's portions. At the end of their training program, they had to face a final exam before Nebuchadnezzar himself. What was Nebuchadnezzar's assessment of them? In every matter of wisdom and understanding, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. They're still the cream of the crop. Now back to chapter 6. As I said before, the enemies of Daniel knew him. They knew that he would continue to pray and worshiping God. So they waited. They find him worshiping God. And they go to the king. They say, King, didn't you sign a decree that said no one can worship another god for 30 days except for you? You know, the one where the violators get thrown in the lion's den, the one that's from the Medes and Persians that can't be revoked. Well, yeah, I did do that. Why do you ask? Well, that Daniel, who was one of the captives from Judah, in verse 13, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Now, I read it that way on purpose. But I think when you read the Bible, you don't know what tone somebody's using, what inclination they're using. And I think you can hear the contempt that these guys have for Daniel. And it could be read this way. Daniel, one of the captives from Judah. They didn't have to tell Darius to whom he petitioned. Darius knew. When I was a child, and we studied Daniel in our Bible classes, there was an illustration that accompanied the lesson. And it showed a middle-aged man standing contently with all the lions laying around beside him very passively. That's not correct. How old was Daniel at this time? Let's do the math. How old was he when Jerusalem was conquered and he was taken into captivity? 20 to 30 years old. Who's in charge now? The Persians, which means the Babylonians aren't in charge, which means the Babylonian captivity has ended. How long was the Babylonian captivity? 70 years. There was some kind of time there before before Darius could reorganize his kingdom. The likelihood is that Daniel is 95 to 100 years old at this time. So he's been doing what he's been doing for nearly 100 years. And his enemies still call him the captive from Judah. After trying to strip him of his Jewish identity, after serving under two empires, he has not conformed to their culture. He has not let their culture shape him. He is still the captive from Judah. Darius is very upset, and it is he that tries to find a way to get Daniel out of this mess, but ultimately he must send into the lion's den. And after Daniel was cast in, verse 16 says, "But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." How did he know that? Daniel told him. As an advisor to the king, he had often had opportunity to speak with the king, and I'm convinced that Daniel told him about the one true God, about the God who cares and protects for those who are his, about the God who is in control of all. Stone is rolled across the mouth of the lion's den, and the king goes home for fasting and a sleepless night. At daybreak, Darius runs to the lion's den, and he calls out to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions?" Daniel replies, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angels to shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And before you also, O king, I have done no harm." The king is relieved. He throws Daniel's enemies and their families in the lion's den, and the lions have a feast. Then Darius makes another proclamation, beginning in verse 25. "To all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in the heaven and on the earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." Again, how did he know that? How did he know about the kingdom that will never end? How did he know that God protects and cares for those who are his? We know that the ancient kingdoms didn't operate in a vacuum. They knew what was going on with their neighbors, but they weren't intimately associated with their religions. So how did he know this? Daniel told him. Daniel told him about the eternal God that controls everything. He told him about God's care for his people. He told him about the kingdom of God, including, I believe, about the coming Messiah. What did he say? His kingdom shall never be destroyed. I think Daniel probably told Darius about the Nebuchadnezzar's great deed, the statue with the head of gold and the chest of silver and brass and so forth. And I think he explained to him that the stone that's landed on the feet and crushed that idol was the coming Messiah and of the kingdom that he would establish. One writer proposes an interesting timeline, and it fits pretty well. He puts forth that Darius is indeed another name for Cyrus, who conquered Babylon in about October of 539 BC. It takes him 5 to 6 months to reorganize his kingdom and assign his governors, Daniel being one of them. And that at this time, that would have been about March 538 BC. And it was at this time that his official reign began. And then the events of Daniel 6 are occurring after this. And he speculates that the proposition that they laid before Darius about praying and so forth was kind of like an inauguration of his reign. Here, we'll worship you for 30 days at the beginning of your reign. Undoubtedly, based upon Darius's confidence that God would deliver Daniel in verse 16, and the proclamation we just read in verse 25, Daniel used his opportunities to speak to Darius about God. There's one prophecy that specifically mentions Cyrus, and that's in Isaiah 44, beginning verse 24. God confirms through Isaiah that he, that is God, will cause Jerusalem to be inhabited again. And in verse 28 he says, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple, your foundation shall be laid. Isaiah 45 begins with God speaking to Cyrus, although Cyrus is 200 years in the future. God says that he is responsible for Cyrus's future success, not Cyrus, not his pagan gods. And in verse 4, he gives the reason why. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call your name. I name you, though you do not know me. Cyrus, you're the man, you're the agent to do this. And in verse 13 he says, I have stirred up in him righteousness, and I will make all his ways level. He shall build my city and set my exiles free, not for price or reward, says the Lord of hosts. I think Daniel explained that prophecy to Darius. And as a result of that caused Cyrus to set the captives free in 538 BC. The decree that he issues is found in Ezra 1. It says, thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God in Jerusalem. Do you see how that proclamation exactly mirrors Isaiah's prophecy? God gave me the kingdoms. He's charged me to build him a house. All the exiles can go free. I think it was a conversation with Darius that caused him, with Daniel, that caused Cyrus to issue that proclamation. The first return of the exiles was in 537 BC under Zerubbabel. Daniel got to see the fulfillment of God's promise. God had said, Judah, you've sinned, and I'm going to send you into exile for 70 years, but you're going to come back to Jerusalem, and you're going to rebuild the city, and you're going to rebuild the temple. Daniel got to see the fulfillment of that promise before being sent from Babylon to Susa and dying there in 536 BC. We're never going to be thrown into a den of lions, but we face our own metaphorical lions every day. In 1 Peter 5:8, he says, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Peter tells us we have a lion, and he's after us daily. It's the devil. All the folks in Hebrews 11 faced their lions. They faced their crises. They survived. David faced his lions. If you look at the Psalms, you see the challenges that he had. In Psalm 7, he says, O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me, lest like a lion I tear my soul apart, rending it to pieces with none to deliver. In Psalm 10, after presenting a litany of problems he's had with his enemies, arrogance, scheming, boastfulness, greediness, cursing, deceit, opposition, he says he lurks in ambush like a lion in his thicket. And in Psalm 17, David prays to God for deliverance. And in verse 12 he says, like a lion eager to tear, as a young lion lurking in ambush. When Daniel faced his literal lions, how was he delivered? God shut the mouths of the lions. Peter, how can we be delivered from our lions? Humble yourself before God. Cast your cares on him. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Resist him. Remain firm to your faith. James tells us to submit to God and resist the devil, and he will flee from us. Where did David find his relief? In each of these pleas to God, he seeks the only source of relief. In Psalm 7:6, he says, arise, O Lord. In your anger, lift yourself up in fury against my enemies. Awake for me, you have appointed the judgment. And in 10:12 he says, arise, O Lord. O God, lift up your hand, forget not the afflicted. And in 17:13 he says, arise, O Lord, confront him, subdue him, deliver my soul from the wicked by your sword. How can we defeat our lions? We can't, but God can. And he will when we submit to him and put our complete faith and confidence in him. If you've not done that, Jesus extends his invitation to you this morning. We've already sung about it. Come to me, all you labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come take my yoke upon me and learn of me, for I am meek and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The rest that he talks about there is not the weekend off, not retirement. It is the eternal rest with God in heaven. It's the rest that the Hebrew writer says yet remains for those who are faithful to him. If you've not been obedient to God, you don't have a hope for that rest. That may be harsh, but that's the case. But if you want that rest, we can take care of that today, this morning, right now. Be obedient to God, be baptized for the remission of your sins, and rise to walk in a new life. And if in your Christian life your consistency has been inconsistent, if you need help from the people here or help from God himself, we can take care of that well. Whatever your needs, come while we stand and sing.